my dears. Oh, you can't see my shirt based on the camera angle. This is so upsetting. I bought it just for this video. Okay, hold up. It is, I'll stand up. It's black and it says, "Your mom," quoted by Sigmund Freud. It's also a very gender affirming shirt and it's insanely soft and I'm upset by both of those things. Also, I guess we'll do the rest of the audio description. I'm discombobulated this morning. I'm a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall with leaves on it, and I'm wearing what I just talked about with a gray sweater on top. You've seen the title. Today, we are embarking on a quest to decide, once and for all, does Freud suck? I know, but hear me out. I constantly dunk on this man. Every psychologist and psychology student I know also constantly dunks on this man, and everybody is very confident that they have a solid reason to, and like most of my psychology classes just kind of went, he existed, he's the father of psychology, most of the stuff has been proved wrong at this point, most notably the whole everybody wants to smash their parents thing. Also, he consumed a lot of cocaine. We're not going to go over him too much, and then just moved on and we never really talked about him. But now that I've spent the last few years running a channel that has a playlist titled "Psst, Your Psych and Bio Profs Lied to You," or something like that. I didn't actually look that up. It's something like that. I'll link it above. I don't know if I can fully trust that those professors would be entirely truthful about hating this dude without doing my own research, because I've learned that a lot of other things I learned in class were also wrong. And you know, critical thinking is important, and that's what we like to support on this channel. And I'm dragging you along for the ride because there was no way I was sitting down and researching this voluntarily on my own and not sharing it. So here we are. Here's what I learned, which is actually more divisive than I expected it to be. Anyway, brief content warnings for addiction, drug use, mentions of abuse, essay, sex, and anti-Semitism. I think that's it. I'm gonna keep things as light as humanly possible. We're here, it's happening. Okay, so, Freud. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in what is now the Czech Republic. He moved to Leipzig and then Vienna when he was a young child, and he lived there until he, an atheist raised in a Jewish family, escaped the Nazis in 1938 to go to London, where he died a year later. He got a medical degree from the University of Vienna in 1881, and he established a practice as a clinical neurologist, treating patients with various emotional disorders, primarily women diagnosed with hysteria. In 1885, he studied with Jean-Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet. I speak French. French physicians who discovered that hypnotic therapy effectively cured people of hysteria, which they and Freud thought carried some sort of important information about consciousness and the human brain, primarily that the brain can create several versions of the self that are not aware of each other. When he returned to Vienna, he kept working with his patients using these ideas and found through hypnotic therapy that many of them had experienced SA, or that they couldn't remember that they'd experienced SA, but they did in their childhood, which he learned via hypnosis. I'm sorry, this part of history is very vague and unclear. That's my general understanding of it. He began to wonder if maybe sex was the primary cause of all emotional problems, which he later made the basis of his personality theory. His first solo author book, titled The Interpretation of Dreams, was released in 1900 and low-key flopped, but eventually picked up steam. Like a lot of steam. He published over 20 volumes in the span of like 19 years. So, let's talk about his theories on personality. And we're bringing out our friend the iceberg. I really enjoyed this low budget diagram from Wikipedia, so that's what we're gonna go with today. So he believed that personality was kind of made up of two major systems that aren't actual physical structures, they're just mental processes and also kind of metaphors. Hopefully that made sense. The first thing is the three different levels of awareness. We have conscious, what we're presently aware of, which is the tip of the iceberg. Pre-conscious, what is stored in our memory and accessible to us, but not currently aware of it, basically the water level and just below. And unconscious, the part of our mind which is at the bottom of the iceberg and completely, you cannot get anything from it. The unconscious bit carries all of our primary motivations for life and our repressed thoughts and feelings. We're gonna get to that. The second part is the three parts of personality. We have id, ego, and superego. Id, which we see at the bottom of the iceberg here, is the original personality that appears at birth and is entirely in the unconscious. It is ruled by our biological instinctual desires, divided into life instincts, survival, reproduction, and pleasure drives such as food, water, sex, and death instincts, destructive and aggressive drives detrimental to survival. This is where we get the concept of a death wish from. It mostly focuses on the alive things, but sometimes it doesn't. That was never quite explained to me. Its primary goal is to satisfy all of these basic drives as quickly and easily as possible without any concern for potential consequences. The other two parts of the personality develop out of this one in early childhood. Next, we have the superego, both the unconscious and conscious on our little iceberg here. It's basically the conscience and our understanding of cultural behavioral standards. It focuses on what is moral and good and how one should act. And then in the middle we have the ego, who's in charge of dealing with both the id and the superego and wrangling them into working properly together to fulfill instinctual drives within realistic constraints and also protecting the personality while it does that. It's pragmatic, realistic, and it weighs risks before doing things. Now, all I can imagine with this is a really sad black and white version of Inside Out, but it's just the three of these guys in little brown suits with the glasses having a fist fight. So you get that image in your head now too. Congratulations. An example of how this process might work would be the id really wants food because it's starving and it doesn't have any money, and the ego figures out how to carefully steal the food to not get caught, and the superego creates feelings of guilt. But this job, of course, is very hard for the ego. It's doing the mostest. So it uses defense mechanisms, processes that distort reality and protect us from anxiety, to help it take some shortcuts while trying to moderate between the id and the superego. First, we have repression, which is unknowingly placing an unpleasant memory or thought into the unconscious, which is not the equivalent of gaslighting yourself into believing something didn't happen. It's the brain just automatically forgetting that a thing happened on purpose. It's not a conscious thing that happens at all whatsoever. It just poof, gone. Then we have regression, reverting back to immature behavior from an earlier stage of development, such as coping with anxiety by sucking your thumb. Then denial, refusing to acknowledge anxiety-provoking realities. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Displacement, redirecting unacceptable feelings from the original source to a safer substitute target, such as yelling at your kids because you won't yell at your boss. Sublimation, which is replacing socially unacceptable impulses with socially acceptable behavior, such as going on a run to get out frustrated energy instead of punching someone. Reaction formation, acting in exactly the opposite ways to one's unacceptable impulses, such as feeling really insecure and therefore acting super cocky. Projection, attributing one's own unacceptable feelings and thoughts to others and not yourself, such as telling somebody else that they're lonely and desperate and sad when in fact you're the one who's lonely and desperate and sad. Rationalization, creating false excuses for one's unacceptable feelings, thoughts, or behaviors, such as, oh, I was just having an off day, that's why I punched the man in the face. I'm not actually the kind of person who punches people. And identification, dealing with feelings of threat and anxiety by unconsciously taking on the characteristics of another person who seems more powerful or better able to cope. That one's also pretty self-explanatory. So those are our defense mechanisms. And according to Freud, unhealthy personalities develop when a person is too dependent on defense mechanisms to the point where they're not facing reality, and or when the ego is unusually weak, or the id and superegos are unusually strong. And repression, according to Freud, is the primary defense mechanism. He also thought that the first 6 years of life are the most important in creating the personalities of adults, and by age 6, your personality is pretty much fixed and isn't going to change. Which brings us to the psychosexual, please YouTube do not demonetize this video, stage theory of personality development. This was hands down the worst part of this video to research. Also, one of my textbooks began the section on the topic by very clearly stating that Freud did not talk to any children before mapping out this theory as an obvious disclaimer of, we do not support this man, which was so funny to me. I'm gonna speed through this as fast as I can. Okay, so we have two key concepts. We have the erogenous zone, which is the area of the body where the id's pleasure-seeking energies are focused during a particular stage of psychosexual development, and fixation, which is when some of the id's pleasure-seeking energies remain stuck in a psychosexual stage due to excessive or insufficient gratification of instinctual needs during that stage of development. Basically, the erogenous zone changes depending on the stage, and if it doesn't change for a person, they get somewhat stuck in that stage, and that has a huge impact on their personality. I read that both somebody who's overindulged in one stage will want to stay where they're at because it's comfy, and someone who's frustrated and doesn't get indulged enough will also want a stage. So there's no win. There's no way to win here. There is no win. I also think that I missed words in that sentence, so it didn't make sense. Moving on, the stages are oral stage, 0 to 1.5 years. The primary focus is chewing and sucking on things because that's how babies explore the world. And oral fixation later in life may lead to smoking, gum chewing, overeating, drinking, and talking too much. Foreshadowing. Next stage is the anal stage. From 1.5 to 3 years of age, the primary focus of this is doing a good job with potty training. Don't mess up the potty training. If you potty train too harshly, they may become an anal retentive, where they try to get even by controlling their poos, later becoming too orderly, neat, stingy, and obstinate as a human, or anal expulsive, where they rebel by just pooing everywhere all the time, and then later in life will become sloppy, disorderly, destructive, and cruel. Then we have the phallic stage, lasting from 3 to 6 years of age. This is the one we're all thinking about. The primary focus is their attraction to their opposite sex parent, This is the point where boys experience the Oedipus conflict, where the boy becomes attracted to his mom and is afraid that his dad, who is his rival, is going to find out that he likes his mom and is going to castrate him. There's also the lesser-known Electra conflict for girls, ruled by penis envy, where they are haunted for life about their lack of penis. They cope with this by repressing these feelings and identifying with the same-sex parent to learn about morality and gender roles. An unsuccessful resolution of this may cause conflicted gender roles, sexual relationship problems, and maybe even homosexuality. And maybe it's just me, but I'm really horrified at the fact that he thought of kids ages 3 to 6 in this manner. Like, what if we didn't sexualize children though? Like, what if no? Anyway, so the latency stage. I'm in a new level of sarcasm that I have never seen before. So next we have the latency stage. It's from age 6 to puberty. This one, there just isn't an erogenous zone. I don't know if he just like, I don't know what the plan was for this, but there is no zone because the primary focus here is cognitive and social development. And then from puberty through adulthood is the genital stage, where the focus is the development of intimate adult relationships. So that's his theories for ya. There's also the seduction theory, which he published in 1896. I'm roasty. There's also the seduction theory published in 1896, basically saying that after talking to a whole lot of women in his practice, he's concluded that the origins of hysteria were their experiences of CSA and SA, which made the scientific community at the time kind of explode, because they were like, you can't seriously believe all these crazy hysterical women are telling the truth about that. What is wrong with you? So then a year later, he was like, yeah, no, they're not recounting real SA. They're recounting their own fantasies, and it's not actually real. Which, ew, but if you look at his writings from after that time, it seems like he kind of believed both things to be true at the same time and maybe just said the second thing to save face a little bit. In the 1980s, there was a really aggressive, like, dethroned Freud movement where some things were taken a little bit out of context to make a point, and then that was revitalized in a 2017 book that some scholars question the objectivity and therefore trustworthiness of it, and the seduction theory has been used as a pawn in every single one of those situations and ripped apart in both directions to the point where it's truly confusing and unhelpful and there's no actual context or like objective understanding of what happened there. So I don't feel like there's enough solid unbiased information on it to make further assessment, if that makes sense. So maybe I'm not doing the best job of representing Freud by kind of ignoring that theory, but I think it kind of needs to be a little bit ignored given how it's been used politically within like psychology politics. The other thing that he wrote about and talked a lot about was dreams. Freud thought that the dynamic unconscious created dreams as a way to tell us about our unconscious desires, but the thing is, those desires are just too unacceptable and stressful and taboo and like usually sexual that they can't just say things explicitly. We would be too horrified. So it needs to disguise them by making it deliberately confusing and obscure and metaphorical. So if you ever down the line want to jokingly give Freudian explanations of people's dreams, the thing the dream appears to be about is called the manifest content, and the actual underlying meaning of it is the latent content. I highly, highly recommend Freudian-style dream analysis. It is never not funny. Now, speaking of Freudian analysis, let's talk about psychoanalysis, or what he called the talking cure. After working with psychoanalysis and creating this method of therapy, all of his ideas kind of came out of what he found in practice and in his work. This therapy would be about 4 to 5 one-hour sessions per week over an average of about 3 to 6 years, where a client would lay on a couch facing away from him and would basically just word vomit. And then Freud might comment, maybe direct their thoughts, but otherwise he would stay quiet and listen. To figure out what somebody's issue was, he would interpret meaning from small mistakes, errors, and memory lapses that are known as Freudian slips. He thought that these uncovered the unconscious desires, such as like, oh, forgetting somebody's name means that you don't actually like them, or something like that. Freud's job here would be to make the unconscious conscious for the client, because only an expert analyst looking from the outside can truly know somebody's personality. This process is called developing insight. Also, another goal was transference, which is when the analyst becomes a major part of the client's life and the client begins to react to the analyst on the basis of their unconscious childhood fantasies. Why did everything have to be sexual with this man? What were you doing, Freud? Why? Some methods used to guide this development of insight would be dream analysis, free association, which is when the client just keeps on talking without any censorship or filtering, which allows streams of consciousness to flow unimpeded, interpretation, when the therapist suggests possible meanings of things to the client and looks for signs when the correct meaning has been discovered, and analysis of resistance, meaning that if a client resists something offered or some idea given, that shows that in fact that is the correct interpretation because the client is avoiding that thing. If you're wondering how effective this was, the other treatments at the time were like institutionalization, shock therapy, sedation, horrifying things. So this was definitely better than that, which is theorized to be the reason that this caught on so much, but we're gonna get to that later as well. It is important to note that Freud very much fudged data. We know that he fudged data. He occasionally claimed the ideas of others, particularly predecessors, as his own. He fully lied about curing many patients that then ended up institutionalized after his treatment. He created a lot of false memories via leading questions of SA that tore families apart, and also justified some horrible false memory ideas that are still causing active harm today. I have a video about that up here. He destroyed the majority of his treatment notes, which in modern day, confidentiality is important. Maybe this makes sense, but back then everybody saved everything because clout, so him destroying all of it feels very sus to me. And also the ones that do survive clearly show that he fudged his data. In a study of the 43 treatments about which some information survives, it turned out that Freud had broken his own rules for how to conduct an analysis, usually egregiously, in all 43. There's also Emma Eckstein, who went to him due to severe stomach and menstrual pain. Modern scientists think that she had hemophilia and an ovarian cyst. Anyway, he thought this was because she admitted to masturbation in some of her psychoanalysis sessions, and that he could fix that via nasal surgery. And then the surgeon left a ton of gauze inside of her and also tried to cauterize the wound with cocaine, and there was profuse bleeding and she nearly died. Also, some accounts say that both he and the surgeon were under the influence of cocaine during that surgery. Other records do not say that, but given this guy's track record at the time, I don't love it. I would assume that he probably was a little drugged up. Also, he was a huge misogynist, and while his love letters to his wife are known as being some of the sweetest ever, some more resurfaced semi-recently that are very abusive and controlling. But let's go back to the drugs thing. This is the side tangent where I had to learn about the history of cocaine. This video broke me in a way that I truly cannot put words to. So, cocaine comes from the coca plant. It looks like this. Basically, the leaves are a mild stimulant and pain reliever, and they were and are commonly chewed by the indigenous people living in the Andes region of South America where it grows. German scientists wanted to figure out how to isolate the stimulant feeling, and so they crystallized it into an alkaloid salt in 1855 that we know today as cocaine. It slowly gained popularity within the medical community, being used as a treatment for morphine addiction in 1879 and as a local anesthetic in 1884. It made a really great anesthetic in comparison to other anesthetics at the time. That's also another conversation for another day. Now, Freud had a friend who was really struggling with morphine addiction, and he really wanted to help that friend, and also straight up said, like, I want to cure him so I can become famous because of it, which, you know, I'm glad that you wrote it out. I'm glad that we know more about your inner motivations. So he did a bunch of research and he learned about cocaine, and he had some of it sent to him, and he tried it out, and he said that it created an increased sense of self-control. It felt like it was clearing out his head and unlocking a section of his brain he could never see before. Wonder what that turned into later. And he published a paper titled Uber Coca about how great it is, and then it kind of really took off, became the miracle drug for everything, was put in everything, everywhere, and a lot of doctors were like, oh, I should try this before I recommend it to my patients, because, you know, it's the right thing to do. And Freud wrote about how he used it really regularly for himself to get through the day. He also recommended it to literally everybody that he met. And in case you didn't know, because they didn't, cocaine is highly addictive, so this time period in the medical community was truly a wild time. In 1891, Freud's friend with a morphine addiction who he had tried to help by giving him cocaine ended up dying of morphine and cocaine addiction. And 4 years later, Freud had to have surgery to fix his nose because the swelling from the drug use caused him to be unable to breathe properly. And he also reported heart pain, depression, and difficulty concentrating, but just still insisted not addicted to this drug at all. And then a year after that was the Emma Eckstein thing that we talked about earlier, and Freud felt very guilty both for what he did to Emma and for the death of his friend, and is generally assumed that he quit using the drug after that. But he was known for smoking up to 20 cigarettes a day and constantly chewing on them. He developed mouth cancer in 1923, and over the next 16 years had 33 different surgeries to try to manage it. But a recent look at his medical records and the fact that he lived with this cancer for 16 years seems more like it wasn't a cancerous tumor, but rather lesions from long-term cocaine use, meaning that he very probably still used it after 1896. So yeah, the majority of what Freud wrote about human consciousness was written while he was probably quite high, but also so was a lot of everything else written by so many other doctors at the time. Anyway, after learning about how this guy functioned, the fact that there were so many students of his who kind of just stopped working with him pretty quickly once they made their own name does not surprise me. Also, Freud was known for just breaking off friendships with people who opposed him because he didn't like being opposed. Most of the psychoanalysts in his circle who disagreed with him centered their disagreements around, yeah, childhood's really important and talking to people is really important, but like, Social and cultural influences are really important. You're really sex-focused, Freud, and also very pessimistic, and it's weird. And I would agree with that assumption. These people became known as Neo-Freudians, and as their work gained popularity, psychoanalysis slowly lost momentum, which I feel like was kind of self-inflicted on his part. Four Neo-Freudians that you may know include Erik Erikson, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Karen Horney. Brief rundown of each person for the sense of historical thoroughness. Erikson believed that personality developed over the lifespan rather than being solid and fixed by age 6, and social relationships play a large part in personality development. He created a different life stage system with 8 stages. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious was not just a random holding cell for all the repressed stuff, and that it included the collective unconscious, which was a theory that there are universal experiences of humankind that every human has built into their unconscious via archetypes such as the god, the mother, and the hero, which is why myths across cultures are so similar. And then we also inherit small personal archetypes that affect our personality development. My hot take is he was trying to explain generational trauma, but doing a really terrible job of it. His concepts are generally seen as not at all scientific and way more mystical, but they've been heavily picked up by the fields of religion, anthropology, and literature. He also proposed that personality had 2 main attitudes, extroversion and introversion. This is where that comes from. And there are 4 functions or cognitive styles where development varies depending on which are dominant. These are gathering info via sensing and intuiting, and evaluating info via thinking and feeling. All of those things ended up being taken up in the 1920s by a mother and daughter who created the Myers-Briggs type indicator based on that. So if you know about the MBTI thing, that's where this comes from. I should make a video on personality tests. I have an irrational vendetta against them, and that's a video that definitely needs to happen. Anyway, Alfred Adler felt that the main human motivation was striving for superiority, and that infants felt dependent and inferior, and so our basic motivation for growth and success in life as humans is overcoming that. And I feel like if this man read disability theory, his head would explode. He created the terms inferiority complex for someone who never overcame that initial feeling of inferiority, often as the result of unloving, neglectful, or indifferent parents, leading to mistrust and feelings of worthlessness. And also superiority complex for someone who has an exaggerated opinion of their own abilities, making them self-centered and vain. And Karen Horney felt that human motivation is based on the need for security, and if we do not have that when we are young, it leads to neurotic behavior and disordered personality. She thought that the 3 basic neurotic personality patterns were moving toward people, compliant and submissive, moving against people, aggressive and domineering, and moving away from people, detached and aloof. She wanted people to take control over their own mental well-being via self-help and analysis, and she also thought that Freud's whole thing about penis envy was complete BS because, if anything, men get womb envy. So there you go. Let's talk about what we know to be true. First, modern psychodynamic theories still emphasize the importance of childhood experiences, unconscious thought processes, and addressing inner conflicts, but they don't use much of Freud's terminology, nor do they focus on sex as the origin of personality. There's little to know. Probably more on the no, evidence of the psychosexual stages as being a thing, and general conversations about it lean toward the conclusion of all this focuses on after-the-fact interpretation rather than anything that's actually real or testable, which I'm inclined to agree with. We now know that unconscious processing is a very important part of brain function, and that we don't sit around and think about how we do basic processes like breathing or reading or walking or thinking, but obviously not all of that is a completely unreachable pit of information as Freud suggested. And our cognitive unconscious also does not have complex motives or inner conflicts and is not separate from the rest of the brain. That's just not a thing. What we have now is called dual process theory, which basically means that there are 2 different evidence-based systems in the brain for processing information. System 1 is dedicated to fast, automatic, unconscious processing, such as reading words or knowing what 2 + 2 is. System 2 is dedicated to slow, effortful, conscious processing, such as taking notes on a chapter or solving 238 times 232. There's also subliminal perception in that sometimes we experience things that, without realizing, influence our behavior, like seeing 10 different posters for one movie and therefore feeling more interested by that film than the one you saw only one poster for because you're more familiar with it. Or the fact that seeing a lot of information about old people makes people walk slower, which is interesting. These things are unconscious, but again, not in a Freudian way. Also, repression in a Freudian way seldom, if ever, occurs. Obviously, that's really hard to test in a laboratory setting, so it doesn't occur, but we can't specifically say that because we don't technically know. And most of the evidence that did exist for repression existing had to do with a lot of leading questions and not people actually coming up with memories themselves. However, very important however here, I don't know if you are at all familiar with Anastasia. I'm referring only to the Disney musical here, but basically the plot is she completely forgets about like 14-ish years of her life and then is slowly able to gain some of those memories back given the right external retrieval cues later in the show. And the first time I saw the show, I was mad because I was like, this is some sort of weird Freudian thing and it's horrible and it's wrong and no. And then I had a fun little medical event, was diagnosed with dissociative amnesia, and learned that no, it's a thing. It is a thing, but not in a Freudian way. A lot of the medical explanations of dissociative amnesia are still super Freudian, which makes it seem like it's not a real thing, and that bothers me. But basically when trauma happens, sometimes the brain just gets so confused and overwhelmed that its ability to encode memories gets kind of wonky. And so rather than encode the whole thing in one go, it will split it into tiny disjointed pieces, and that feeling of separation and disjointedness between different parts of memories makes it to the person experiencing it feel like it was dreamlike and detached from reality and therefore maybe not real. Sometimes the brain decides to do that with everything. That's known as DPDR. Sometimes it does that with a specific event and then everything that happened before it or everything that happened after it, and it can become a lot harder to access and process if possible at all, leading to huge gaps in memory, which is dissociative amnesia. And external cues can trigger flashbacks, which, if organized properly or thorough enough, like in my case, I kept a spreadsheet and put all the pieces together, can turn into more easily retrievable memories. I have a video about memory loss that I will link up here. What I'm trying to say is that as more people are getting diagnosed with dissociative conditions and forms of memory loss of late, as research is getting stronger on those things of late, people are trying to think that that means Freudian repression, and I want to be extra clear that those two things are not the same thing at all. They do look similar from the outside, but they are completely different things. We do not know the entirety of the cognitive mechanisms that cause dissociation yet, but bottom of the iceberg with the aid of the superego is not the answer. The other Freud thing is dreams. There's actually some level of returning of suppressed thoughts. In studies where people were exposed to topics and one group is told to suppress thoughts of that thing, everybody dreamed about that topic, but the ones who did the most were the ones who were told to suppress it, which makes sense because we know that the more you deliberately try not to think about a thing, the more you're going to think about a thing. That's called the rebound effect. And when you're sleeping, it's harder to aggressively be trying to not think about a thing. So again, not suppressing or repressing into the Freudian depths, but a more surface level deliberate ignore that causes it to bounce back into our thoughts. There are two major theories for dreams, being Freud's psychodynamic, your unconscious desires are coming from your dreams thing, and then the activation synthesis theory, which says that they're just a random mix of neural signals that our brains are trying to make sense of and find meaning in. I am inclined, and most people I've talked to about this are also inclined to believe that it's mostly random, but occasionally the things that we're actively stressed about do find their ways into those dreams, but that's just my personal opinion on the matter. I've never been a dream analysis kind of person. But again, if you ever get bored, do fake Freudian dream analyses with your friends. It's so much fun. Freud's psychoanalytic therapy was technically not the first kind of talk therapy because technically hypnosis came first, but for all intents and purposes, it was the first. Today, traditional psychoanalysis is practiced in only about 5% of therapists, which honestly shocked me. I thought that number was going to be a lot lower, but pretty much all other psychotherapies are somehow based in Freud's insights, ideas, and practices. There is evidence that his therapy isn't really effective, and also some solid evidence that some aspects might be actively straight up harmful, particularly the more interpretations a therapist may make of something, the worse the relationship between the client therapist gets and the worse the clinical outcome. There also kind of came a point that like psychoanalysis is really time consuming in comparison to say CBT and medication, and also less evidence-based. In fact, most of his theories in general are not evidence-based at all. So the next question is, why do we care so much? And that actually comes down to literature, interestingly enough, because you see, Freud's theories and ideas were all based on a lot of literary things, Oedipus being the primary example of that, which then made people connect his theories to other things in literature, because they were like, oh, if it's based in that literature, then it must be the human condition, and we'll connect it to all other media. And that made people then put his theories into their own literature that they were creating at the time, which meant that he seeped into every single aspect of our culture so much that it became completely unavoidable. And now these things are in our everyday language, despite most people not knowing where they actually came from or what they actually mean. A study recently found that of the 1,175 courses that reference psychoanalysis, more than 86% were offered outside of psychology departments. This man is everywhere, and not just in literature departments. The majority of acting training is explicitly based in Freudian concepts. So if you're wondering why acting school is so awful, that is why. I have a video about all the acting theories up here if you are interested, but we need to answer the main question of this video. Did Freud suck? And I thought that my answer was going to be a lot more confident and a resounding yes than it is, but I still think the answer is yes. He was not very nice to his wife. He nearly killed some people. He lied about his own data to make himself look better. He low-key sexualized children and generally seemed kind of like a pervy, hypocritical guy. But He got a lot more right than we give him credit for. These things are so ingrained in our culture today that we look at him writing about them for the first time and point out all the obviously wrong things without realizing that the rest of it, the things that we see as common sense, were not common sense back then. He thought about humans and brains differently. He started outpatient mental health care. He showed that mental illnesses were real and could be treated. He showed that childhood was important for adult development. He created the whole basis of research that everybody since then has been creating the field of psychology and moving it forward based on trying to debunk everything he ever said. He got people to take these things seriously and do something about it. Yes, the general consensus is that a lot of things have not been debunked because we have not found a better and clearer answer for it yet, while we generally know that the things he said are probably not real. But when it comes down to it, we still don't know everything yet as a field, and I think our current need to fully clown on this guy all the time might be a little bit too aggressive in the other direction and a bit self-aggrandizing because the field of psychology is still so new. We still don't know so much, and maybe a bit of our hatred of this guy is to tell ourselves how cool it is that we know better now, in the same way that we laugh at Victorians not knowing to wash their hands before doing surgery. Will I still laugh at the Oedipus complex and the fact that he thought that the brain was putting things in metaphors to hide them from us? Absolutely. Do I find joy in the collective inside joke of us all laughing at Freud? Absolutely. But I do think, as painful as writing this video was, we should be talking about him more in psychology classes rather than just going, he was weird and did drugs a lot and started the psych field, moving on, because there's a lot to be learned from his mistakes and from the history of how our field was very much created on the basis of a whole lot of misogyny and cocaine. Like, if we want to decolonize the field of mental health care, I feel like maybe this is very important information to understand and have in order to move forward as a field rather than just dismissing him altogether. Or maybe I'm just too hung up on how flawed our education system is and everything in my brain always finds its basis there. I don't know. Either way, I'm rambling. This video broke my brain. I need to be done now. Whatever video I do next week better be light and fluffy and simple because I need to like sleep this one off. Also, I do want to say, while we're talking about silly goose brain things, my camera has been out of focus for like months and it's always bothered me, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna fix it. I'm gonna figure out how to fix it. And I kept forgetting, and I would film videos and I'd be like, oh, mad that it was out of focus. I read the manual this morning and I needed to hit 2 buttons to fix it. My camera's been not focused for like 6 months because I frankly my whole YouTube career, because I didn't hit 2 buttons. So, you know, the more you know. Anyway, thanks for listening, thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.